Barry Bluestone and Diana Eck and Bob Orsi for a very stimulating send-off into conversation and thought. And also to all of you who made your contributions. I had no idea that Detroit would be so effective in helping us understand. We haven't even heard from all the Detroiters here today. All Detroiters, please stand. I think there are three or four. Oh, go ahead, please. No, Bob Brutel, you're a Detroiter, and Jennifer Metch, and so there's at least 5 or 6, 7 maybe. And frankly, there are several other cities that will join the discussion. In fact, Springfield, Ohio, sent its mayor to be with us. Warren Copeland is a professor, but he's a mayor. And there are many cities represented here that will join the discussion. It's all very helpful. Now, we are going to, it was planned, of course, that the community theme would become so prominent, would emerge so prominently in the previous session. And therefore, we plan to have the session on community right now, right? And to examine what kind of community there emerges, what kind of community is possible, how community is created and to some extent destroyed in and by congregations and other communities of faith, and how all of that is affected by this huge phenomenon that Barry Bluestone has called the Triple Revolution. The singing we heard, if you heard it over your talk, that comes from Temple Israel. You could show the sanctuary of Temple Israel, if you would. There. That music came out of this beautiful sanctuary at Temple Israel. But my thinking is that singing is one of the many ways that people come together, build relationships. My colleague at UIC often says if people stand and sing together, regardless of their diversity, they begin to develop a common identity. And I think there's something to that. But in our study, we find that where that church is located, where that congregation of whatever faith, who lives near it, and how it's constituted, whether it's constituted as a commuter church where people decide to go there, or a parish church that people are in it because they live there, is very essential in deciding what kind of community one gets. The timekeeper says my portion has passed. Is that true? I had 1.5 minutes, right? In that case, we will go on. I will just say that we have selected 4 churches. One of them is in North Dorchester. That's St. Mary's. And do we have them? One is St. Mark's in South Dorchester. Both of their pastors are here. Temple Israel, and one of its rabbis is with us, and Grace Chapel, and a member of its educational staff, or the pastoral staff, is here, Dana Baker. And but we're going to start off with a presentation that really comes out of the data generated through the dialogue between our project, our student researchers, and congregations, not only those 4. The thesis, the interpretation we're getting comes from essentially all 30 of you congregations, but we've selected these. And Simon Mainwaring, who's an MTH student at Harvard Divinity School, a deacon in the Church of England, and a student who's spent a great deal of time very productively in St. Mary's Church. That's the same church where Father Ellis Clifton, who spoke in the first session, is pastor, is priest in charge. And he's going to make a presentation from all of these that we'll then discuss in the roundtable discussion. Thank you. Simon.
I'll pay you later. I want to just pay homage to Father Ellis Clifton, who is here, shall I say, by the skin of his teeth. That's a nice thing I'm saying, because he's about to leave this fair city to go and work somewhere else. So I have been greatly enriched by my time at St. Mary's. So this one is for you, Ellis. So I want to try and think about how the 4 churches that are trying to be used as, if like, exemplars of the 30 that have been studied by the team here, may be thought of in 2 different ways. And 2 churches, St. Mary's and St. Mark's, thought of as, we're going to think of them as predominantly bridging churches. Churches that bridge communities. Not as opposed to, but as a different distinction, the other 2 churches, the other 2 congregations, I apologize, Grace Chapel and Temple Israel, are those which we're going to concentrate as being exemplars of bonding communities, commuter faith communities, which people come, and within that space, that, if you like, that sacred space, community is a bonding kind of community rather than a community that fosters a bridging between communities in a locale. So the first church is St. Mary's Church, where I was working and still do, in Dorchester. There it is. It's been around in Upham's Corner in Dorchester since 1888, and it's a good example, I hope, of being a bridging community. So how is it a bridging community? Bridges both extend and gather across differences. St. Mary's ministry is not so much focused on being an extending bridging community between different ethnicities, between the police and the youth, between young and old, but although this is all the work that St. Mary's does, rather it's a bridge that gathers. What I mean by this is the distances collapse, the distances of social division, by creating a space that allows the culture of that place, Upham's Corner, the street of the Cape Verdean and other ethnicities, to be reconstructed, if you like, re-articulated in a new hybrid way of fusing the sanctuary and the street. In short, place matters because it is transformed under the guise of its repetition or reconstruction within the boundary, the meeting of sanctuary and street, what we call in places like this a liminal space. Well, this is evident on a Sunday morning with multiple ethnicities in the congregation, reflected by different flags that are hanging from the church interior. The bilingual reading of the sermons and of the liturgy of the word. The smells and tastes of soul food from Chef Lee's. The Cape Verdean, we had a lot of that last Sunday, Cape Verdean food and Irish stew and all the different tastes and smells. But not just on a Sunday. St. Mary's is a space that gathers people into a new hybrid space of multiple belongings through the week. It's food pantry. And most notably the youth, who are predominantly but not exclusively Cape Verdean, learn for themselves, I believe, tools of resistance and survival for the street, where they are othered as Cape Verdean youth. For St. Mary's, then, place matters and is manifest in its commitment to seeking out both resistance against all that is life-denying on the street, and also seeking out redemption both for the street and also on the street. Place matters because it's where people are found and encountered. Place matters because it is where, for St. Mary's anyway, Jesus is articulated not exactly on the street and not exactly in the sanctuary, but somewhere in between. Second church for whom place matters in this neighbourhood sense is St. Mark's, South Dorchester. And we're pleased to have Father Finn here to share this morning. I'd like us to think about St. Mark's as a bridge that connects or extends. It's more a classic parish structure, one with parish boundaries that are defined, even sacralized to some extent, by a church hierarchy. St. Mark's is not in a neighbourhood, it is a neighbourhood, as Bob Ossie already shared. Changing populations has been as great as it has been in Upham's Corner. Many former parishioners have moved away, and many of the current members are very recent arrivals. But new people are being incorporated. It does not mean that they are being assimilated in the sense that, because we can see in the parish school, rather, that many children speak different languages, there's little English. Parish meetings require lots of translation, potluck dinners, as with St. Mary's, have a multi-culinary extravaganza. Being incorporated means, as in the words of one parishioner, at St. Mark's we know each other by name. They do hundreds of door-to-door visits and one-to-one conversations and scores of house meetings every year to keep this knowledge up to date. They've even hired a community organizer to do this, and I believe who's a graduate of this school. People do want to do useful things from Harvard Divinity School. They decided to act together to offer ESOL and citizenship classes that organize a neighborhood watch and get it together with the citywide issues of GBIO. They celebrate both the actors and the actions of being Catholic in the community. So now let's turn to two further congregations for whom place matters in a very different way to the gathered parish, the commuter congregations. The first is Temple Israel. This is where the source of the music was, and we're drawn to Temple Israel first because of their leadership role in the GBIO, especially in generating the political muscle to get the Affordable Housing Trust Fund established in 1999 and then last year to keep it from going under. Then we learned their ability to do this depended in part on their doing the same kind of one-to-one conversations that St. Mark's does in the neighborhood. Except at Temple Israel, they do it among all their members wherever they live, not among all the residents of a particular place. Something like 1,600 units or households as members, building relationships between members in order to promote the public good citywide. It's not a place-based community in that sense, but a place-targeted one. Staying in the city for Temple Israel was a major decision. The membership residences are concentrated but sprawling westward, especially in areas with high Jewish populations, meaning that Temple Israel is not located where synagogues are concentrated, but where its members live. The last congregation is Grace Chapel, which has a wide diversity of ministries for Christian nurture, practical aids about how to live, and ways to be of service to others in the church in Boston and around the world. Church makes it easy to be involved. Lots of people are there, something like 3,500 members and growing. Grace Chapel has the widest distribution of membership, perhaps in more parts of the city and the suburbs, concentrated though around expressways, but not only there. It has lots of small groups, 150 or more. It's a big church with lots of little churches inside, similar in some ways to other churches such as Park Street that we've studied. We found at Grace that members identify with this church as their place. Little importance is attached to the place of residence, though. It's attached to the place of mission or of ministry. The more interested in the need or the cause, not where it was. One of our members went on an annual urban plunge, for example, and gave members a day in several places where they could help others and learn about local ministries, Dorchester, Roxbury, Lowell, Lawrence. And it was the need and the ministry that defined the outing, not the place where the ministries were being done. And of course, almost no one is engaging in the ministry with, or helping, or learning about their own neighbours, or the place where they lived. So to quickly sum up, how does place matter to these different congregations? We found first that regardless of size and regardless of whether they concentrated in a particular place, all these congregations were building trusting relationships, developing common norms of behaviour, sharing information which enabled the communities and their individual members to accomplish more than would otherwise have been possible alone. In the jargon of the day, they generate social capital which pays both private and public dividends. We think the public benefits from soup kitchens and homeless shelters to new affordable housing and housing legislation fostered by the congregations we just discussed have resulted in part from the communities they foster and the social capital they create. However, these larger commuter congregations, at least those with small group ministries, seem to form relatively intimate communities comprised of similar, like-minded people, whereas the relationships developed in neighbourhood-based congregations tend to be civil, but not necessarily as intimate, and to be comprised of people whose differences are more obvious than their similarities and agreements. Differences means different races, ethnicities, different ideologies, different tastes and values. What they have in common is a stake in the neighbourhood and faith. While communities of the like-minded do good works, just as diverse communities may exercise political muscle by pulling together, it seems that to be in communities that share a particular location, we see in those neighbourhood communities of faith a reweaving of social fabric that have been disrupted by the forces of the Triple Revolution we've heard of earlier. They collectively reinvest in the actual places where people live. These communities are helpfully, if imprecisely, described as generating bridging social capital, as opposed to the bonding social capital of the commuter's like-minded churches and congregations. Finally, we think that in these local neighborhood communities of faith, a different kind of theology perhaps is present, one in which the congregation is the recipient as well as the source of spiritual nurture and theological truth, a theology of immanence, if you will, one through which the congregation may find God in the city and its people as it mediates God's love and salvation to that wider community. Place then does matter to religious agencies that focus on communal agency in the city, and that this bridging might ultimately have more of a chance to foster incisive bonding in the city than commuter congregations with self-selecting small groups. Commuter congregations have bonding character formation might help to collapse the distance of social divisions because of an orientation cultivated in that space of a sanctuary. But the communal neighborhood agencies are more likely to cultivate such a collapsing of social division because their very missiology is constructed to be both in the city and of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The panelists for, or the roundtable discussants come from these congregations: Rabbi Jonah Pesner, Father Dan Finn, Father Ellis Clifton, and Dana Baker. So if you would all come and take a seat at the table here, please. And this microphone is mine, so do the others. While they're doing it, I would like all the members from St. Mark's Church to stand so you can be seen. Members from St. Mark's? I meant St. Mark's Parish. Yes. There you are. Welcome. And could we see everyone from St. Mary's also? Yeah, great. And Rabbi Pesner, did anybody come with you?
Not intentionally, but Chris Winship, we're happy to say, is a member of Temple Israel.
Chris Winship is a member, and I understand Chris's son is studying privately and looking to be a rabbi with one of the rabbis at Temple Israel. Welcome. And finally, Grace Chapel.
I'm alone.
Are you here? Well, it's wonderful to have you all, and I'm going to change microphones now and join the table so that we can talk to each other. Now, everybody here knows that we're not really making mini speeches as you would on a panel. We're engaging with each other. However, in a situation like this, where we have collapsed huge amounts of information into a thematic presentation, we're bound to make mistakes. And of course, even after a year, or in some cases 2 years of work, we haven't seen all that needs to be done. So I'm going to ask that we start. You need to be very brief, but you may just think we need to be set straight on something about what we have said here, and I'd like to give each of you a minute or so to either do that or elaborate or praise us or whatever you would like to do. That's you probably have seen Father Dan Finn in the paper, because St. Mark's Parish is one of those that other Catholics in South Dorchester and in the hierarchy have, in my view, unwisely recommended for closure. And there's a big struggle. It's kind of an epic struggle between cosmic forces here at work coming to place there. So, Dan, it's wonderful to have you with us and to share with us. And maybe you would go first, but you can't use all of those notes at once.
Okay. Thank you, Lowell. And it's very important to recognize where we're at St. Mark's. We've been there for 100 years, right in the heart of Dorchester, and we were hoping to celebrate our 100th birthday next year, and we are confident we will. And place is, as you know, perhaps in Dorchester, we identify ourselves in terms of parishes. That's how connected the place is to the identity of the membership. So I feel very correct in saying what you've identified is very much the case with us.
Put a slide of your member.
Sure. That people who have been a part of the parish for a long time, been born there, raised, and have all the important rites of passage. And some of the new members that have come in the last years, because of the work that we've been able to do in relationship and community building and action in the community, I think we're in good shape as far as the Archdiocese as they consider decision-making about the future of the parish. And it basically comes down to the existence of a community that was well intact for about 70 years, but in the last 30 years, people moved out for various reasons, and there is as many as 20 nationalities there at the moment. But we would have been passing as ships in the night were it not for we undertaking intentionally and deliberately building relationships of trust and respect. And we recognize that out of relationships people act. So we've been able to do a lot of action in the community at large around ESOL and citizenship and public safety and housing in connection with GBIO, Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. So I just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's great. The parish is, the church is this black pyramid here. And these are where most of the people, I mean, each dot represents a house or an address. And I think we could do the same thing with Grace Chapel while Dana gives us a little talk here.
I guess I'd kind of like to respond to a couple of things. I think one thing is that Grace Chapel actually probably is very reflective of the demographic, things that we were talking about earlier, because the sort of similar and like-minded, which is the way we were phrased as, would have applied to us, probably 10, 12 years ago, where I would say the congregation was probably 98% white people of European descent. But in the 12 years since, we have dramatically changed. And actually, as I was talking with Lowell yesterday, he said that there's a tipping point at like 80% where you can actually start to call yourself multicultural. And we have hit or actually surpassed that. Last year, I actually am on the staff in the area of multicultural and urban ministry. And last year when we did a celebration, we actually did a little survey of our congregation and put together a little map. And we had over 50 different nationalities represented within our congregation. And when you come on a Sunday morning, we have Asians, we have people of African descent, African Americans, Haitians, Hispanics, all kinds. And so that's very different. And I think actually it is, causing us to start looking at some of the things that maybe some of these churches that have been in more diverse communities for a while to start facing in those kinds of interactions. I think the other thing I wanted to talk on was the, being a commuter. We draw from over 60 different communities, and so we have had to deal with the issue of being a commuter church to a certain level and understanding. I mean, you literally can be standing next to someone in a service and not know that they live 3 or 4 blocks away from you unless you ask them that question. And so one of the things that we have been doing through our small group ministry, and this is a new vision actually that we have been fleshing out more since we were interviewed, so it's not as reflected in the study, is to try and help people understand more where they're coming from and getting to know people in those areas, developing what we termed regional gatherings initially. Now we're actually working towards a vision of what we're calling life communities, which is to intentionally encourage people to not only participate in the large corporate worship at Grace Chapel, which I think is probably well described in the presentation, but also to get a sense of their community. Who in Grace Chapel is in their community? Can they come together? Can they learn about their community? Can they participate? Can they learn who their neighbors are, get to know their neighbors, build the relationships? And so we actually are moving towards a model that takes advantage of both settings, the large corporate setting, but also the more neighborhood setting, and being more intentional about both. And then the other thing is we do have a commitment. We have an ESL program. We have a food pantry. You may be surprised to know that there's a need for a food pantry in Lexington, but there is. And so we have long-term commitment to the city of Boston, and so, we work to do those kinds of bridging things. It's a little bit more logistical difficulty than if you're right in the neighborhood, but we do it.
Thanks. Now to Rabbi Pesner. We'll shift. And by the way, on these dots represent anywhere, the big dots represent a couple hundred households, and the little dots represent from 1 to 10. So, and that's the same with Temple Israel, which is just about to be put up there. So,
by way of thanks to Lowell, this is the kind of resource that we would never generate internally, but is so helpful to us as we imagine who we are and where we live. And so thank you for doing this today. It's also helpful to hear from each other and realize that our journeys may be so ethnically different or so different in so many ways, but are so elementally similar in some ways that it's really reaffirming. I also want to acknowledge that all of the experiences that I share at Temple Israel, we didn't invent. We actually had great mentoring and Father Finn and actually Andrea. Where is Andrea? Andrea Shepard, who's a brilliant community organizer who I haven't even seen in a couple of years, met with us, and we were one of the first Jewish congregations to say, how would we do some sort of community building campaign that would lead to social justice in the city? And GBIO helped us connect with the good folks, with Father Finn and Andrea, to learn how to do it. So I'm really in the presence of my teachers and thankful. I have a couple things to comment on, but I'll at least pick one for right now, which is I think Simon really nailed it on the head when he told the story of Temple Israel, which will, starting this September, begin to kick off to celebrate its 150th birthday in the city of Boston. As in this complicated ethnic history of Boston, the Jews kept moving west. Temple Israel has always maintained its presence in the city of Boston, and we're on the border of Brookline intentionally. We're on the other side of the Riverway, so that it is actually technically a Roxbury address. And even though some of our members are driving past 10 synagogues to get to Temple Israel, they do so because they cast their lot with the city. And of course, with the shifting demographic patterns, now you have Jews who have the generation who have moved back to the city. So we come from many different towns, many different areas, and the city itself. And as the sort of brilliant question of the day, which is how do we reweave the social fabric, what we learned from Andrea and Father Finn was that reweaving the social fabric had something to do both with an internal weaving, creating that, as Diana Eck called it, the network, or as we call it internally, the web of relationships internally. But we at Temple Israel feel and understand that the internal weaving is related to the external weaving. Our relationships within the congregation are inextricably and inspirationally linked to the relationships outside the city. So as we ask internally, we just had a house meeting campaign where we had 50 house meetings, and 700 or 800 people participated in talking about what they cared about. We asked the question both in terms of what they were looking for internally for their own synagogue community, but how that impacted on what they could do to make the world better outside. And of course, having partners like Greater Boston Interfaith give us an outlet for us to be woven into the fabric not only of our individual congregation, but the city in which we live.
Thank you. Brother Ellis.
Thank you very much. First of all, a lot of talk has been done about my work at St. Mary's, but it is not my work alone. It is our work, the members of the entire St. Mary's Parish family, that have caused a change in the transition to happen at St. Mary's and be successful. A lot of times we're characterized as being that church that does a lot of youth ministry. But we don't see ourselves as being a church that focuses on youth ministry. But it is a relevant, needed family and community ministry focusing on the concerns and the needs identified by the community. Now, that does happen to be children and youth, but you see that there is a difference, that we're responding to the needs of the community and not just seeking as a place to draw kids into. The needs of the community are first, and could possibly change and dictate direct the ministry that St. Mary's is currently offers to the community. St. Mary's is a church that had an immigrant beginnings. It was a point, and it still seeks to be a point of entry in that geographic community for people who are coming into the United States. Our history dictates that we were the point of entry for Canadians when they first came into this area, and now it is Cape Verdean, and we're seeing the increase in the congregation of Dominican and other Latino people. Finally, I guess in this time of briefness, if I was to sum it up, what is offered at St. Mary's, I would say that St. Mary's is a place where we see church as sanctuary, meaning offering a safe haven. Church is family. There are so many forces out there that seek to compete with us for the souls and the lives of the very young people, children and youth that we want the best for. And so we see that we have to extend family in a competitive and in a different way to attract the young people to us so that we will not lose them entirely to the destructiveness that sometimes occurs in the streets. So where church is family, church is a life skills development center, church as the beginning of a place of redemption and a place where you can know and understand love. And all of this is done in the context of the teachings of God, and in particular to us through the teachings of Jesus Christ. I thank God for St. Mary's and the vision of the people before I got there in formulating this vision. And I pray that the work of St. Mary's can continue.
Thank you, Father Ellis. And I might say that I hope it will too, and that some way St. Mary's and the diocese and the various and several Episcopal churches who support St. Mary's, that they'll continue to do that on the kind of agenda that you have set up. And by the way, Trinity Church Copley is represented here. It's one of the supporters of St. Mary's, Bill Franklin and a couple others. So thank you for being here. Now, folks, we took a somewhat controversial stance that if you wanted the sort of bridging, to make the diversity real, you needed a neighborhood and a church that took the neighborhood seriously. And in a certain sense, Calvary and Temple Israel were examples of how you don't get much bridging real relationships across boundaries if you have commuters. On the other hand, we never meant to say that people need to find people like themselves, and to be together and to like being together. So I think that both Jonah and Dana have, corrected us a little bit, and we appreciate that. But I wonder if all of you might be willing to reflect on the matter of sort of what is it about that makes a community possible in the context of a religious congregation. Do people need to be similar, or do they need to can you foster a kind of mutual respect and appreciation regardless of the location that isn't utterly dependent on likeness or on place? So,
well, I'd say as far as St. Mark's goes, there was a time about 40 years ago when the religious community of St. Mark and the civic community were one and the same. We were, as a matter of fact, almost the only show there. But as time went on, we became a part of the pie. And if we just continued to do as we had been doing in times past, we would really have been isolated and no longer playing a leadership role in the community in which we are. So it was in our own self-interest for survival to begin, as well as many other reasons, why we had to be proactive and initiate bridges to the wider community in order to survive as an institution and as well as to carry out the mission that we have. So in doing that, we were able to establish a lot of common ground above and beyond any religious affiliation, based on that people live there and walk the streets. And we found that everybody, for the most part, wants the same thing. They want a safe neighborhood, a good school, a good job, be able to pay the rent, and so on. So the common ground that we've arrived at in and through relationship building, in self-interest and resources, has become the basis for which a lot of the work that we do. And common ground is holy ground, and that's what we've come to recognize. And as well as be enriched by all of the interaction that has been going on among us in the wider community of St. Mark in that area of Dorchester.
I just wonder if I could ask, that's very helpful, Dan, but could I ask Dana, what is the motivation for your church to get people in Saugus to know each other, or people in Wellesley, or or Acton?
What's driving that vision?
Yeah, what's driving? I mean, why bother? Isn't it just easier to? I mean, it would be easier to let people gather where they choose, right?
Well, I mean, I think what we have seen, and one of the advantages of being a large congregation, what we have tended to see people gather, at least in our own church, I mean, is around what we call affinity areas. In other words, women's ministry, children's ministry, youth, and all that kind of stuff. More life stage types of things, single and young adults. And although we see the benefits of that, and there are definitely great things in terms of teaching and all that kind of stuff that allows curriculum to be developed and address specific issues related to those life stages. And what's been neat, actually, is I think that affinity base has allowed us to embrace people of other cultures, because really all cultures are struggling. Like if you're a woman, or if you have kids, or if you have children, you're dealing with many of the same things. And so I think what's interesting is that now that we have that and we've started embracing people of other cultures, we've realized that there is a value in people, and it really did come a lot from knowing that you could walk into the church and there might, like I live in Medford, and until we started having the regional gatherings, I didn't know the people in my own church that lived in Medford. And I think that was very unfortunate from my standpoint. I'm an architect by training. I just moved into vocational ministry about 3.5 years ago. And to me, place is important. And so to realize that I could go to a church and not know who my neighbors were. And so I think that was the initial thing gathering it. I think our other idea is that we want to see our faith lived out whole, not only on Sundays, but also in the communities where we live. And you can't do that unless you have sort of a critical mass that's gathered together that has some like-mindedness, but then you have to turn them outward into their community and embrace where they are and have an impact on their neighbors, and not just on themselves.
Jonah, what I'm aware of most about Temple Israel's commitment to place was stated in Simon's presentation. You're concerned about big places, Greater Boston, or at least Boston, and issues in those places. Is there a dimension of backyard or local? I mean, your people are mainly in Needham and Brookline, right? And to some extent further out.
Our number one city is Brookline. Number two is Newton, and number three is Boston. And then 30 other municipalities. Right. But you ask a great question, because you and I have been in dialogue about Temple Israel. We have one rabbi who's dedicated to community building in neighborhoods, which is a whole other element of Temple Israel, which is very much like what Dana described, right? What he does is he goes around setting up Shabbat dinners, which is our, Friday dinner is sort of our big peak moment, as opposed to the Sunday meal or something like that, or Sunday service, in people's homes and neighborhoods, right? So as Jews have congregated in Jamaica Plain and are members of Temple Israel, or as Jews have congregated in Newton and are members of Temple Israel, they'll share Shabbat, not at Temple Israel, but in a group of 15, because place matters and relationships matter. So neighborhood, or the neighborhood parish, was the intersection between place and relationships. People are joining Temple Israel for an overarching, what we would call gestalt, which is the Yiddish word for zeitgeist or some, which is German for, help me out. The energy we share, as Diane described it. So our gestalt is a gestalt of people who are seeking something common. Remember, one of the things to people at Temple Israel, this is going to come as a shock to you. We're all Jewish. Actually, I shouldn't say that. There's any number of interfaith couples who have married a Jew and a non-Jew, and so we're not all Jewish, but everybody's looking for something Jewish, and they may or may not get it in their neighborhood, right? So it's a little different than the parish system. So you have to come to a Jewish place, and Orthodox Jews will live by their synagogue because they can't drive on Shabbat, but liberal Jews don't have to. I just so much related to this conversation, Lowell, is the question that was asked by Robert Orsi at the beginning, which is there a Jewish understanding of time as it relates to work and as it relates to place? And the answer is yes. And I would urge everybody to read a great book by Abraham Joshua Heschel called The Sabbath, in which he suggests that Judaism elevates time over space. It's about encountering the moments of the divine wherever you are because of the rhythm of the experience you're having, whether it's the external rhythm like Friday comes and work stops, or the rhythm that you create, like I'm about to have a piece of food, and so I sanctify God, who is the source of that food. So that place matters, but what I think binds us as people of faith is that we elevate ourselves above place and connect in a something more deep and primordial way. What's great, one more word on Heschel, if you read something like Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, Heschel, who marched with Dr. King, understood the connection between faith and our relationship to the divine, which transcended physical objects, and the action that called us to actually do something about it in the world.
Thank you very much. Time intervenes here in Harvard too, and we have asked Dr. Elfriede Wedam from University of Illinois at Chicago to give some reflections on community and its relation to social capital. And I see. Is it? What? Thank you. I'm disturbed too, but I have to sort of fold this project. Sorry, Father. But Elfriede Wedam is actually the person who taught me how to do ethnographic work. I got the grant, but I didn't know how to do the studies, and so she came to joined the staff, and we built a project. And I always say she's the real sociologist in this team in Chicago. And as many of you know, the work we did in Chicago is foundational to the work we've done here in Boston. So, Elfriede, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Lowell, for inviting me. I am very honored to be here, and Lowell and I learned a lot of field work together, so don't believe him when he says what he said before. I do regret, though, that I am coming after your discussion. So much of what you said is better said than what I was going to say. And so I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to add to this. I'm keeping my remarks very brief because Lowell insisted that I do so. And I know we're running late on the calendar, and so I can't talk about everything that is of interest, and there's so many important themes in this session. I did select to talk a little bit about social capital because that is such a buzzword, and it's a favorite of many people. It's not one of my favorite. Lowell likes it a little bit more than I do. And because it's used in so many different ways, I thought I would just try to give a brief definition of what I think it means and how I think we can use it to analyze what's going on in some of these congregations. I regret that I can't talk about them all, but I think you'll probably see from the remarks that have already been made the similarities among them. I think that it's important to break down social capital into the various processes that it consists in, because it's not just a one thing. People tend to throw a lot of different aspects of social action stir it in a pot and call it social capital. It's about, I want to talk about how to separately understand these processes so that we can understand better how the outcomes that are achieved are done so in and for the congregations and the communities. So my definition of social capital begins with the important theme of today's conference on relationships. It's through relationships that individuals gain information and trust, and hopefully if that trust is actually extended, relationships continue into a chain of relationships that then become the networks that help obtain the new resources that people strive for, especially resources both to benefit the individual and the community, but resources to attain economic ends. Primarily, in my understanding, it's to obtain economic ends. So to me, social capital is about the ability to ask for and receive resources. Now, at St. Mary's, the relationships that are created are not about economic ends. They're about creating a new moral universe, a new moral community, where diverse people are no longer strangers, as we heard from Simon, are no longer strangers to one another, no longer othering, but joint participants in a cultural domain, or the liminal space, as he calls it, in which the members operate with revised ethnic and racial identities and less personal inequality. To just break down what I think happened, this two-way process that happened in this liminal space. On the one hand, this space permits the members of the church, so longtime members of the church, the Anglos, Hispanics, and others, there to change some of the Cape Verdean youth so that they can resist the worst of street culture, the street culture of violence, drugs, gangs, and take on the norms of middle class and working class families that are modeled for them in the church. The other side of that relationship is the process that permits the Cape Verdean youth and their families to change some of the non-recent immigrants and the longtime members so that they can include new cultural styles and people into their moral universe in the church. But all this seems to happen to and for individuals, is my understanding, and perhaps you can inform me on this. It happens to and for individuals more than for the community. But nonetheless, in a small way, it changes the street. St. Mark's Parish also is based on relationships, and parishes work to overcome the kind of social distances among members that we know about exist in all large congregations, and it's a typical problem among parishes. We've assumed that because members live close to one another, they know each other, know one another, they care about one another, and so on. That was never the case in Catholic parishes, and Joseph Victor in the 1950s pointed out that problem to us, that there are many levels of relationships and intimacy in Catholic parishes. But through the community organizing model that St. Mark's has taken up, these kinds of relationships can be better built more broadly throughout the parish. It's helped by the physical proximity of the parish. And using the one-on-one relationship building then allows members of the parish to develop the stronger neighborhood consciousness that leads to a collective identity and ownership. But today, without the exclusivist, racist tendencies that parishes have been part of in the past. And the ownership can be more readily instituted. This ownership can be more readily mobilized, for collective action on a variety of fronts to improve the material lives of all residents. So I see the relationship building in St. Mark's as having stronger outcomes for the community. At least there's more of a tendency there, rather than the outcomes for the individual members, as I think is more emphasized in St. Mary's. I think, just to conclude these remarks, there is still a strong tension between the focus of congregations and other kinds of community level work there's still a continuing tension, let's put it that way, between the focus on changing individuals and changing the community. Each of those efforts has their own weakness built in. A tendency to focus on changing individuals is more likely to lead to sort of moral crusade. The tendency to focus on communities tends to lead to turf battles. So what I think I want to conclude with is my agreement with some of the remarks that were made earlier, and a rabbi from Temple Israel, I think, put it very well. Internal weaving is related to external weaving. And the emphasis and the effort on combining those two or overcoming those tensions, I think, is extremely important for the future of the city and of our neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you join the table here for the meeting? Elfriede said some things about St. Mark's that might give Father Ellis something to react to. Are you as individualistic as she says? I
was more interested in reacting to allowing the Cape Verdean youth to take on middle class values, and I don't see that as a goal or actually what we're doing. But it's giving them the freedom to reject the negative programming of media, of the forces that be that tend to shape and infect their lives. They're given a place in which they're free to be their natural selves, and as a result of that, something positive happens in their lives. Also, just on the use of space, we have a theology there that any religious institution is a gift of God for the people of God, and so when you give a gift, usually, there are some parameters in which you can use it, but you determine, for the most part, the use. And so we allow the community, the youth when they're there, the adults when they're there, to shape the use of the church. And, I just want to make certain that that's clarified, and the middle class values. There's a strong reaction from me on that.
Did you want to?
Well, I said middle class and working class because I don't want to put you into a straitjacket, but I do think that we have to identify where in the social space, as it were, of our society that people fit in and want to be in. So maybe that's not a careful way of identifying people, but that was a way of sort of addressing the kinds of class hierarchies, for better or worse, that we have in our society.
Not to be argumentative about it, but
here's my argument, right?
The adoption or placing in categories. I look at the 5 young people that I brought with me, and I have one person back there whose mom was a teacher in Cape Verde. Another person, so these another person whose mom worked in the medical profession, and another person back there whose relative is a politician, a top-ranking politician for the Cape Verdean Republic. So, it's not necessarily the adoption of any values, but to act on the things that were already there. Things are already there that our system oftentimes prevents people from acting on. And there's a difference.
Mm-hmm. Was there anyone in the audience that wanted to come in on this point, or in response to the panel or to Dr. Wedam? So, yes, could you? This is Laura Perez-Hester from New York Theological Seminary. Speak loudly, please.
I appreciate that last interaction. I don't want to say anything further. My own background is Cape Verde.
All right. Bon tardi.
I wanted to raise another subject. There were interesting comments made about regional gatherings or house meetings in some of the churches represented, some congregations represented on this panel. And I wonder if we presume indeed that we are moving toward, we have already moved toward a different definition of
So.
and adding to the potential power and resources. So I just wondered if there was...
Please, anybody care to comment or?
I would say in your remark and in this remark also in regards to the closeness of our membership living right there in the neighborhood, as you indicated, doesn't mean that people care about each other at all. But I think the presumption is that there's community existing already. It's more like a collection of individuals until you do something to make community happen. And that's what we've been doing. We recognize we have social capital at our fingertips outside the front door, but it's a way underdeveloped, and it will remain so until you take an initiative, such as we've done, to raise up the gold that is there, which is our people, and the diversity, raise it up and have people meet and exchange stories of where they're from, their pain, their passion, their promise. In that interaction is where the Spirit is ignited, that gives us the energy to keep our own congregation alive and to be able to work with, for example, meet with Temple Israel and many other congregations around the greater Boston area to act on the bigger issues that we can't act on. So it's there, but it's not realized in almost many of the congregations that I know.
Other comments? Yes, this is Frank from St. Mark's.
Are we acquiring young people in our congregations? I'm talking teens, 20s, and even 30s. That's to all temples.
Well, I can say when St. Mary's came in the room, the median age dropped substantially.
On any given Sunday, about 30 to 40% of our worshiping body would be children and youth.
I also want to say part of the reason we were driven to go into neighborhoods was to respond to that very question, which I'm glad to know is not a Jewish question, but is an interfaith question, because the synagogue, it's highly ironic that we showed the Temple Israel bima, which we rarely use, right? So when you hear that singing that you heard when you walked in the room, the line, 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 we're all out in the congregation walking around singing with guitars and tambourines. Everybody's in a group. Because that's the way we do things. But we also realize that big building doesn't attract necessarily someone who's 30 and looking for meaning in their life. So that's why we hired this rabbi to go into a neighborhood like the South End or JP or what have you and ask the folks living there, what are you looking for Jewishly? And if you don't come to Temple, we'll bring Temple to you. So I think the answer is yes, but you have to be a little bit different and weave a different kind of fabric to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what people are drawn to Grace Chapel for is we have a really strong children's, youth, and young adults. We have a thriving young adult ministry there. But I think one of the things that we're seeing, and again, the reason for getting out in the community, is not everyone that is in that age group wants to come inside a church and will not come to Grace Chapel. And so one of the things that we want to do is, homes are of your neighbors are safe places for people to come and explore issues of faith. And so we want to be that presence in the community so that as people have questions and want to ask questions, they feel comfortable asking their neighbors and they know who they are and that there are opportunities to be invited to, a wide variety. The early church in Acts. That's really what we're trying to recreate in some ways.
See, there's a moment without hands up, and it's... was there? Oh, she's standing. Forgive me. So, this is the final.
My name is Louise Beach. I'm a member of Changing Church, and I do an outreach agency for persons with disabilities. And I went to St. Mark's to sit down with Father Hill. He responded to me as a disabled person. And I went to many churches and got no response. And this is where I'm coming from. We talk about community involvement. We talk about solutions. We talk about putting our children And I know that Father Clifton Ellis is doing something about it because I sat down and talked to him.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm happy to say that 2 o'clock this afternoon, a whole session will be devoted to ministries for and with youth. And we'll explore some of those very issues that you raise. I want now to thank this panel, Dr. Wedam for her scholarly contributions. Everybody's pretty scholarly on this panel. But Father Finn, Dana Baker, Rabbi Pesner, and Father Clifton, for your contribution here today. But, the richness of it is because of your contribution and the contribution of your congregations day by day. And we really do appreciate it very, very much. Thank you. So.